We're now going to take a look at what is called Billy Graham's America and seeing the rather radical shift that the United States made in regards to religion during the Cold War and into the 1960s. In order to do that, we first need to look at revivalism in America and then the fundamentalist surge. We'll then take a look at religion in the Cold War, and finally the pastor from North Carolina. The Crusades, not the Crusades that you may be thinking of, and the ear of presidents. There is a strong history of revivalism in the United States. What is revivalism, first of all? Okay. It's the increased spiritual interest or renewal in the life of a church congregation or society with a local, national, or global effect. That is, the restoration of faith and devotion after a period of moral decline. We have seen revivalism happen in ancient and not so ancient history. The late period of the southern kingdom of Israel, around 600 BCE, resulted in the writings of the priestly tradition of the Old Testament, which gives us the biblical creation story of the world being created in 6 days. Then you had the Jewish exile itself, the period after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians and the exile of the Jewish aristocracy to Babylon and other places. The Jewish exile is where modern Judaism comes into being. Then you have the Christian movement itself is a form of revivalism, where Christ in the Old Testament says, "I've not come to change the law, but to fulfill it." That is a sense of revivalism there. And let us not leave out the Protestant Reformation itself. What we're looking at then is a movement to put life into religion that has grown old, stale, that might be subject to corruption and outside bad influences, to bring meaning back into religion. That's what revivalism is really all about. And in America, looking at the awakening movement, there were actually 5 great awakenings, as they've said. What are they based on? Well, based on powerful preaching that gave listeners a sense of personal guilt, that made them essentially believe that they're going to hell in a handbasket and that they needed to turn to Christ for their salvation. They disregard ritual and ceremony or render it secondary to the overall feeling and emotion. Sermons in America in the 1600s had gotten very didactic, very turgid, a lot of prepared statements that were read, but without a whole lot of feeling or meaning. Instead, what these revivalists do is they make religion intensely personal to the average person. They foster that sense of guilt, but they also give them a hope of redemption. Yes, you're damned, but you don't have to be damned. You have a way out. There's a safety valve. Relationship with Christ. Asking people for introspection and a commitment to a new standard of personal morality. Turn yourself away from the devil. Accept Christ in your life. Put aside the drink, the womanizing, the fighting, the gambling, and so forth. These are the things that will help you get saved. And people throughout the history of the United States accepted this message quite well. The first Great Awakening in this country happened from the 1730s to the 1740s, essentially. And it's no coincidence that these follow upon the Salem witch trials that you have, that many people believe that the witch trials were really a misguided way of trying to refocus the faith and to get it restarted again. In the 1730s, the focus was on old light churches, as they were called, that had grown stale, that was attempting to make them better, get the sermons better. One of the leaders of this is a man by the name of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was a fiery, charismatic preacher. He actually was the grandfather of the famous or infamous Aaron Burr, who shot Alexander Hamilton to death in a duel. Edwards's sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It electrified the nation, and it made him a celebrity preacher throughout all of the Northeast, where he was invited to give the sermon over and over again, and was delivered with such furor and such venom and such passion that people were literally fainting in the pews, coming forward and weeping, asking to be saved. You also had George Whitefield, an itinerant preacher from England who actually helped create the Methodist Church with John Wesley. Whitefield delivers sermons in large fields. 10,000 people would show up, and his electrical style of preaching enraptured people. And he was very egalitarian as well. Blacks and whites could stand side by side or sit side by side at his revival meetings. You see less doctrine, less dogma, more spirit in the preaching. Sort of like pew jumping almost. A more democratic view of religion, as each individual person can work out his own deal with God and not go through a bishop or a hierarchy. This democratic view of religion will influence politics as well, and many say that the First Great Awakening is the foundation of the American Revolution. Now, the Second Great Awakening that happens in this country was in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and one of its great leaders was a fellow by the name of Charles Grandison Finney. Again, an inheritor of the tradition of Jonathan Edwards of great charismatic preaching. Now, this awakening was to focus on those who are unchurched. So you're not going after people that are already in church. You're going after people that have not gone to church. It's also beginning to focus in on the less wealthy and the less educated. Again, you see a great deal of hellfire and damnation sermons, especially in upper New York State along the Erie Canal. In fact, they call it the burned over district because of so many hellfire and damnation sermons. What you also had this is an outgrowth of millennialism. And millennialism is the belief in the period of peace and prosperity before the second coming. And so many of these preachers and Christian advocates were trying to bring about that millennial period before the second coming. And this translates itself into reform movements and into political movements as well. You had reform movements such as temperance, abolition, and women's rights. In fact, a political party in the United States derives its foundation from the millennial Second Great Awakening movement, and that is the Whig Party. The Third Great Awakening is somewhat disputed as to whether or not it was actually an awakening, but it was lasted from the 1850s until early 1900s. The chief apostle of this movement was a preacher by the name of Dwight L. Moody. And this was a continuation of the reform movements that had begun in the early 20th and the early 19th century. And Moody and others begin to affiliate themselves with the social gospel movement, applying Christian ethics to social problems. And the social gospel movement was very palatable to the great robber barons or the captains of industry like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who were making great fortunes and then proceeding to give most of that fortune away in philanthropy. You also had a new organization, the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, which was part of what was called muscular Christianity, where you practice Christianity, but you also sort of masculinized your body. You made yourself tougher and hardier, and you got rid of effeteness and being an overly intellectual person. The Third Great Awakening did spur new religions: the Christian Scientist movement by Mary Baker Eddy, the Salvation Army, and Jehovah's Witnesses. It is marked by the Holiness movement. this was to move beyond the one-time conversion experience. The holiness movement was to say, okay, you've been converted. Now what? You want to sanctify yourself, reach entire sanctification. That's what the Pentecostals and the holiness movement want. They want to seek a baptism in the Spirit, or a baptism of the Holy Ghost, or the Holy Spirit, that enabled those with this special gift to heal the sick, perform miracles, prophesy, speak in tongues. Hence, you see why Christian Scientists, as a basis, do not believe in religious practice, medical practices. Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, do not believe in blood transfusions and so forth. And the Salvation Army is more of a charitable organization designed to bring ease to the suffering of people. Around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there arose within evangelical Christianity what was known as fundamentalism. Now, what is fundamentalism? It's the strict literal interpretation of the scriptures, or strict literalism as it is applied to certain scriptures, dogmas, or ideologies, and a strong sense of the importance of maintaining in-group and out-group distinctions. So there's a lot of clear lines in fundamentalism. Of course, most fundamentalists today, what you would say, believe in the biblical creation story as the explanation for how the world came into being. There's an emphasis on purity in fundamentalism, personal purity, and a desire to return to a previous ideal from which advocates believe members have strayed. In other words, there was this golden age before that we've left, and now we've got to get back to that. There's not a whole lot of tolerance for diversity of opinion. There's this way and this way alone. Christian America, it's the late 1800s, and it's a reaction, as most religious movements are. It's a reaction against modernist theology. And it really gets its impetus from the Niagara Bible Conference of 1878, which says that the Bible was divinely inspired by God and is infallible. In other words, it cannot teach error. It believes in the virgin birth of Jesus, the belief that Christ's death was the atonement for sin, talks about the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and the historical reality of the miracles of Jesus. Now, fundamentalism we have mostly associated with the southern United States, with the so-called Bible Belt. It actually began in the north, but it took root best in the south. The great preacher of fundamentalism was a fellow by the name of Billy Sunday. He was actually born William Sunday. He was a former baseball player, actually a very good baseball player, and then he turned into a preacher. He held, like those before him, large revivalist meetings. He became a leading fundamentalist, and he was a leading prohibition advocate, and many people say that he and several others helped bring about prohibition in this country. Billy Sunday is often reviled today and lampooned. Many say that he was the impetus for the figure of Elmer Gantry, Sinclair Lewis's erstwhile pious hypocrite, so to speak. Although Sunday was not as hypocritical as one might think, he did have his flaws, no doubt about it. There you see Billy Sunday leaving court. Only later does fundamentalism and evolution come together. And this begins with a series of creationism laws in the southern states, that is, to teach the Bible story of creation as science, and to outlaw the teaching of Darwin and the theory of evolution as the scientific explanation for the world. This, of course, resulted in the Scopes trial of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, where a young man named John Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution in his classes. And the head of the Fundamentalist League in Tennessee brings in the famous populist and former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan to help with the prosecution. For the defense, they choose Clarence Darrow, and it turns into a circus in which fundamentalists come out with a lot of shame, very embarrassed by the whole thing. And in many ways, it drives fundamentalism to the periphery. It takes them out of the mainstream. And the Scopes trial is very important because it marks the retreat of fundamentalism from the American scene, and it will not come out again for about another 25 years or so. 25 years after the Scopes trial and the rule of Billy Sunday, the Cold War was going on. Now remember something, that the basis of communism, or one of the bases of communism, is that religion is an opiate of the masses. It's designed to keep people in fear and subservience. And therefore, communists say there is no God, they are atheistic, and that religion is not to be allowed, even. In response to this, during the 1940s and 50s, many said that strong religion was the ultimate bulwark against communism. And eventually they begin to identify Americanism with religion. And all religions, in fact, had come together to unite against communism. And even the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, who was not a churchman prior to his presidency, he allows himself to be baptized by Billy Graham himself, and begins to couch Americanism in religious terms. Many critics say this is piety on the Potomac, that Eisenhower was using it for political gain, and there's no doubt that he was using it for political gain, but there is also a great deal of evidence to suggest that Eisenhower became a true believer during this time. And we see a number of initiatives by the federal government to bring God closer to the state. In God We Trust is placed on currency in 1955, and then it was made the motto over E Pluribus Unum. When the Pledge of Allegiance was formalized many years before, now they add in one nation under God is inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. The Catholic Church was as ardently anti-communist as it came because many of the nations of Eastern Europe were Catholic, and the Soviets were cracking down, imprisoning, and sometimes, in some cases, executing archbishops. What you had were two major players in the Catholic hierarchy. You had Bishop Fulton Sheen of New York, who ran a radio show called The Catholic Hour, and later became a television show, and a very well-watched television show. And you also had Francis Cardinal Spellman, the former Archbishop for the military and now the Archbishop of New York. His chancery, his main offices in New York, were called the Powerhouse. And Sheen and Spellman really drive the outcry against persecution in the Eastern Bloc and the fight against communism. There are many who say that Cardinal Spellman is the man who drove America into the Vietnam War, in part because the president of Vietnam, Yo Zim Diem, was a Roman Catholic. What about Protestants? Protestants were more divided than you may think. There was a marriage of mythic American nationalism with a personal, emotionally intense relationship with Jesus Christ. Not all Protestants bought into that. The liberal, mainline Protestant denominations began to split from the more conservatives, who tended to see the world more in black and white terms and more in terms of a crusade against the evil of communism. This opens the door for the preacher from North Carolina, William Franklin Graham, better known as Billy Graham. He was the eldest of 4 children born on a milk farm outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And at first, he was very much a mainline Protestant, was not a bad kid growing up, was not rambunctious or anything, but felt very much that he was off track. and was not living up to the standards that God had wanted in him. And so he goes and gets himself tutored by the American Independent Baptist evangelist named Mordecai Ham. Ham was a temperance movement leader. And in fact, Graham was very much an advocate of temperance. As a young man, his father made him drink like 6 straight beers as a boy so that he would get sick and develop an aversion to beer. Ham entered the ministry in 1901, and in 1936 began a radio broadcast that reached into 7 southern states. Graham was a very close student of Ham's. Graham goes to a series of schools after high school until he finally graduates from Wheaton College. He does not have a degree in ministry. He has a degree in anthropology. But at Wheaton College, he marries Ruth Bell, who was his longtime wife, who recently passed away in 2007. Despite Graham's degree, he did have experience in ministry and scripture. In June 2nd, 1944, he was serving as the pastor of a small church when a radio ministry called Songs in the Night was about to go under. Well, Billy went to his congregation and said, "I'd like to take over this radio ministry and see if it can be fixed." And his congregation said, "Absolutely." So on June the 2nd, 1944, he took over Songs in the Night. He also served as president of Northwestern Bible College in Minnesota. And in 1949, he conducted his very first revival in Los Angeles, California. You say to yourself, why Los Angeles, California? Remember something, that the war industries of the Second World War in Los Angeles brought a large number of conservative blue-collar workers to the Los Angeles area, especially in Orange County and Long Beach area. Well, putting up circus tents in parking lots, Graham began his revival. It was supposed to be a 3-week revival. It went for 8 weeks, and it packed the house. Graham had actually begun his crusades prior to the Los Angeles revival. His first crusade went from September the 13th through the 21st, 1947, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 6,000 people packed the stadium to listen to him. From that point on, the Billy Graham Crusades took off, and he has conducted 400 crusades since then. One of the hallmarks of his crusade are people who come forward to be saved. Coming forward meant that they came forward, they received counseling, several pieces of scripture and other reading material to take with them, and then a follow-up visit. And when people were coming forward, after it was over with, people sang "Just As I Am" became the hallmark song of his revival. Graham's preaching was very charismatic, again in the style of Jonathan Edwards and Charles Grandison Finney and Dwight Moody and Billy Sunday. He was very charismatic. He is one who believed very much in the sinfulness of man, but he was not condemnatory. He was a guy who was saying, I'm offering you a ladder to get out of your sinfulness. I'm offering you a help, and it's an unconditional help. During his crusades, Billy Graham did not allow for racial segregation, no matter where he was. And he often castigated whites, especially white leaders, for their arrogance, pointing out to them that you're going to have to stand before the Almighty and answer for how you have acted toward your fellow Christians. Several times he invited Martin Luther King Jr. to join him on the altar, and while the two men eventually split over the Vietnam War and a series of other policies, they remained friends and liked each other. They just simply did not do nearly as many appearances together, and many remarked that what might have been had they been able to work out their differences. Billy Graham was no coward either. When there was a bombing at a church in Birmingham during the Civil Rights Movement, Billy Graham went to Birmingham and held a crusade and was not afraid to castigate those who had caused the violence. Selma's March, the famous Selma March, which we have just finished commemorating. Well, that also, Billy Graham went to Selma and had a revival, and those who had been fighting each other prior were now coming forward. Billy Graham had much more broader ideas than just the United States. He wanted to bring the gospel to the world. He mobilized evangelical leaders to collaborate for world evangelization. And he was much more than just simply preaching. He certainly wanted to get Congress to pass more just laws for the poor. He was a social crusader as much as he was a biblical crusader. As many know, Billy Graham has become essentially the pastor to the presidents. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Grant Wacker, who is a professor of divinity at Duke University in North Carolina, and a critic of Graham, but an admirer of him at the same time, has said that Grant has fulfilled the role of preacher, icon, southerner, entrepreneur, bridge builder, pilgrim, pastor, and America's Protestant patriarch. Billy Graham was the first preacher to speak behind the Iron Curtain, speaking both in Poland and in Russia. He went to South Africa and called for an end to apartheid. At first he would not go to South Africa because of apartheid. And then he went down there and said, "I'm not pulling any punches," and told the Afrikaners, the white Afrikaners, to end apartheid right away. Graham is an ardent Cold Warrior. There's no doubt about that. He believes that the Soviet threat, the Soviet communistic threat, had to be met with religious force. He does get into politics from time to time. He opposed John F. Kennedy's candidacy because of his Catholicism. And it was not until Kennedy made the later remark that Graham withdrew his criticism. He didn't endorse Kennedy, but he withdrew his criticisms. Graham was an ardent supporter of the Vietnam War and went to Vietnam several times. Later on in his life, he opposed the moral majority of Jerry Falwell and found it to be much too exclusive, much too strident and condemnatory. He has often declined to enter partisan politics. As I said, he's had the ear of the presidents. He is considered to be the pastor to the White House. He was very close friends with Lyndon Johnson, extremely close with Lyndon Johnson, because Johnson's own grandfather had a great deal of affection for Graham. And he was also good friends with Richard Nixon. Graham met and spoke with 12 presidents, from Truman to President Obama. He did not counsel President Obama nearly as much because by the time Obama came to office, Billy Graham had been elderly and very ill. But the first man chosen to speak at the National Memorial to 9/11 in the National Cathedral in Washington was Billy Graham, and it was one of the most amazing speeches ever. It is he who counseled Dwight Eisenhower to send federal troops to enforce integration. Lyndon Johnson was so close to him that he would have Billy Graham stay in the White House for days on end and would pray at bedside with Lyndon Johnson on many an occasion. What is the legacy of Billy Graham and the legacy of Billy Graham for America? Well, it's really, he is the resurrector of evangelical Christianity. Now, today, evangelical Christianity does not really resemble the evangelical Christianity of Billy Graham. It's become far more politicized and far more strident. He also lays the foundations for the new Christian media relationship. Is that Billy Graham uses the media better than anybody to this point. And he makes evangelical Christianity palatable for many mainstream Americans who are not in the evangelical tradition. So he reintroduces evangelical Christianity to the nation. But Billy Graham also tends at times to blur the lines between the relationship of church to state. Not so much he himself, but those who have followed in his wake have become very political. His son Franklin has become quite strident in his support of current President Trump and the condemnation of same-sex marriage and so forth. But the Billy Graham himself, who, by the way, is still alive and approaching 100 years old, continues from time to time to speak in North Carolina, although he doesn't travel outside of the home nearly as much. But what this shows is, what this whole point is to show how, in today's world, how American politics and religion have become so closely aligned. You can look at Billy Graham, and for better or for worse, he has changed the power relationship between politics and religion.